The presenting sponsor for Socially Democratic is Dunn Street. Dunn Street is a campaign agency that specialises in community organising. We only work with people and organisations who want to build power to make the world a better place. And if you want to create change in your world in 2026, then hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. And finally, today's episode is brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. For over a century, Maurice Blackburn has stood up for fairness, championing the rights of everyday Australians and shaping landmark legal reforms. Today, they're harnessing new technologies to make justice more accessible, more efficient, and more responsive to the needs of modern Australia. All right, let's get on with today's episode. We are taping this one on a Wednesday afternoon on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. And the Feeney Files is normally published on the last Friday of the month for those who regularly listen to the podcast. But in light of the tragic events in Bondi Beach and the terrorist attack on Australian Jewish community, we've decided to bring this episode forward 1 week and to get David and Jessie in to talk about it. Our intentions for this episode is to provide some political analysis on the attack and the response by all of the relevant authorities. But in the second half of the show, we also want to hold a deeper discussion and reflect on what anti-Semitism is in this country. And since it's a left-wing podcast, the broad left relationship with the Jewish community historically, and how we have played a role or lack of playing a role in fighting back against anti-Semitism and how we can be better allies. And to help me discuss this incredibly tragic moment in our nation's history, I'm joined by the former ALP campaign director and federal parliamentarian from 2008 to 2019, David Feeney. Welcome back to Socially Democratic.
Thank you very much.
And the former Deputy Chief of Staff to Premier Daniel Andrews and a Managing Partner at FMRS Advisory, Jessie McCrone. Welcome back to Socially Democratic.
Thanks, Stephen.
Okay, for the listeners that are tuning in from overseas, it may not be completely across the events of Sunday. Here are some of the facts. Sorry, and I'll also point out that if folks want to skip over some of the commentary on the actual attack itself and go straight to the conversation about anti-Semitism, we'll put a marker in the show notes for you to do that, because some of you may be just overwhelmed with all of the reporting of the attack itself. But for those that haven't been paying attention, this past Sunday, the 14th of December, during the first evening of Hanukkah, there was a Jewish festival, a Hanukkah by the Sea at Bondi Beach in Sydney, where two gunmen opened fire on the crowd attending the festival organised by the Shabbat in Bondi. At least 15 people were killed, including victims ranging from a 10-year-old child to elderly adults, Holocaust survivors, and Rabbi Schlanger, who helped organise the event. Some of those victims were members of the Jewish global diaspora who'd come from the Soviet Union, Ukraine, France, and chose to immigrate to Australia in search of a better life. At the time of recording, there are 26 people who are still in hospital with a number of serious injuries. There's at least 8 people who are in critical condition. The alleged attackers were a father and a son, and the father was killed at the scene whilst the son was wounded and has now been taken into police custody. Is actually still in hospital. Both were reported to have licensed firearms and had IEDs, so improvised explosive devices or bombs. And there are ties suggesting their inspiration comes from the Islamic State-style extremism. There was Islamic State flags that were found in their vehicles. An unarmed bystander, Ahmed Al-Ahmed, risked his own life by courageously engaging and disarming one of the shooters, an incredibly selfless act that saved many more lives. And the Australian authorities have declared this a terrorist attack driven by anti-Semitism, intentionally targeting Jewish Australians during a religious festival, and is considered Australia's deadliest terrorist incident on our soil. And it's the second deadliest mass shooting since the 1996 Port Arthur massacre. And our deepest sympathies are with the victims and their families and the wider Jewish community of Australia at this time. So I want to just get initial sort of first thoughts from both of you to learning of this news. And I'll maybe go first. I was in Los Angeles slowly making my way back home when I heard about it. And my first thought was, we pride ourselves on being different from countries like the United States or tin pot dictatorships where political violence is a norm. But this Sunday I felt like that norm was shattered. And it's hard for me to sort of put that back together again in my head. And it's made me really question the country that I live in. David, to you, what are your initial reactions to the events on Sunday?
Well, it was, of course, ghastly. I guess my first thought was shock and surprise. And then as I thought it through, I realised that, sadly, we shouldn't be surprised that this ghastly moment has a context and had a run-up. And it means that Australia is now in the same basket as the United Kingdom and parts of Western Europe where these kinds of acts have happened. We've seen them in Manchester, we've seen them in Paris. And we need to work urgently and effectively if we don't want them to become a regular feature of our lives and societies, as sadly it seems to be the case in some of those other places. So it's a big moment, a big testing moment for our country and our society.
Jessie, what were your thoughts?
Can I just start by saying I echo hearts goes out to those to the Jewish community, and may the memories of the Bondi victims be a blessing. So my initial response is probably born out of several years of responding inside a government to these kind of events, terrorist attacks. So my immediate response was, have they immediately locked down all other events? If you are a state leader, you are thinking this has happened in New South Wales. What does this mean for the Victorian Jewish community? Are we ensuring that everything is covered? Who's making sure that the Jewish community is being reached out to? All of those things are the immediate kind of, and anyone that's worked in politics a long time, that is kind of your immediate thought. It's the same way that every time I smell smoke, I wonder if someone's called a SEMSI about a bushfire. It was perhaps not until the next morning that I properly let the horror of what happened wash over me. I was not only shocked about what happened, as we all were, I think I was really particularly shocked at the volume of footage that I was able to sort of consume, the angles, the drone footage, the fact that there are children now that have seen people getting shot, mowed down, without their parents, frankly, being able to in some way protect them from that. It was horrific. And I think about my youth and I think about how Port Arthur would have impacted me very differently had the volume of social media and filming been a part of that, and how horrific it is for the Jewish community to have to absorb all of that unedited, raw violence. So I think not only was I echo your thoughts, Stephen and David, about how sadly it isn't the surprise it should be. I think it is just a change in the way that these things happen, and that is something we should consider as well. It's probably not the priority right now, but at some point we need to think about what that means for children watching this stuff, and the community and the rest of the public.
David, I'm interested to get your thoughts on, in terms of the response, particularly given your political background when you're in government, the intelligence services, the two gunmen, the son, Naveed Akram, was known to the intelligence authorities as far back as 2019. And there's been reports in the papers in the last day or so that both of them went to the Philippines and potentially went there for military-style training. I'm saying potentially because I don't think that's actually known as a fact at this moment. But, is this a failure of our internal intelligence services, or if not a failure, would they be sort of sitting around looking at each other today going, how did this happen? How did this slip by us?
I think the honest answer is it's too early to know. The grim truth is that, the sheer numbers of Islamists or potential Islamists that have come across for scrutiny by our intelligence agencies is such that It's not possible for our intelligence agencies to monitor them all to the extent necessary to prevent any one of them from being monitored on the day they flip out, I guess. It's obvious our intelligence services have a very fine record of detecting sort of planning and conspiracies and groups and organisations, but it does appear at this early stage like what we're talking about here is a father and a son who cooked this demented thing up amongst themselves. I think one public policy issue that has come to light is the fact that how is it possible that someone or any persons who've had this level of interest from our intelligence agencies can continue to have a gun licence? And the answer to that, of course, is that our gun licensing systems are done state by state. There is no national register, and the silos probably mean that there is no nexus between the intelligence agencies that might have a person under passing scrutiny and the licensing authority and the register. That's I guess an issue of some consequence that will be looked at. But I think it's too early to say that there has been failure. I've been impressed with the words and the tenor and the response of the New South Wales Premier, and I note that there are some police were shot and injured in this incident and were hospitalised. There's been plenty of online criticism of New South Wales Police, and I suspect that's way too early and way too knee-jerk. Obviously, both of these attackers were ultimately shot by New South Wales Police, and they were shot, in minutes, not hours of the incident erupting. So I guess that's a very long-winded way of me saying it's too early to say. I'm sure there will be lessons that come out of it. And as always, having our agencies joined up is critical. But we also have to be realistic about the size, the demographic scale and size of this challenge. And, we're not in a surveillance state. What can we reasonably expect of our intelligence services? And is a consequence of this that we're going to ask more of them?
Mm. The response from the federal government, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has obviously condemned the mass shooting and I'll quote, as a vile act of violence and hate, and has described it as an act of anti-Semitic terrorism that has struck the heart of the nation. The government's called on strengthening gun laws, as you just mentioned there, David, and there's also signal support for the Jewish community, including potential expanding of funding of security and community safety. I thought it was interesting, the comments from former Prime Minister John Howard yesterday or the day before, who said that he obviously supports the further tightening of gun laws in response to the attack, but also in a way criticised the federal government's current approach, calling the focus simply on gun reform as an attempted diversion from addressing the main issue, which is anti-Semitism. But Jim Chalmers, the Treasurer, stood up this morning and said that they'll be working towards both gun reform and addressing anti-Semitism simultaneously. Jessie, what do you make of the political response thus far?
It's interesting because all of those things that David just spoke about will be at the forefront of what you basically consider the operational response to this, ensuring you take the lessons of what happened, ensuring that you are tightening anything you can to ensure it doesn't happen again. And that is a natural space for government. It's a natural kind of idea that when something awful happens, you look for solutions. I think the thing that is really important in moments of significant community mourning and distress is ensuring that you also take a step back and consider the symbolism of the moment and what is important to draw people together. I think a really good example of that is probably Jacinda Ardern when there was the terrorist attack on the Muslim community in New Zealand, and the symbolism which she injected into her response. You saw her a lot wearing the hijab. She was hugging the community and really opening her arms to the Muslim community in New Zealand. I do think that it is really challenging sometimes for governments to take that step back. I do think that that the political response has not been grounded enough in symbolism. I think that I would really love, frankly, to see the Prime Minister wearing a kippah at some point soon. It was really good that he had the Jewish community at Government House. I think it was last night. There was a lighting of menorah. I've seen Jacinta Allen had the Jewish community come into cabinet and a rabbi and light the menorah. I do think that at times like these, demonstration of support and the culture of the Jewish people is incredibly important. And I think that is the part that has not been as strong in this response.
Yeah, it's interesting. I reflected on, you mentioned Christchurch, and I also thought about the 2013 Boston Marathon bombing and the days that followed the bombing when, the whole of New England was in shock. The Boston Red Sox designated hitter David Ortiz, when the Red Sox played their first game after the bombing, walked out into the diamond at Fenway Park. Fenway Park is the cathedral for sport in New England, and with a microphone spoke from the heart. And it's a very famous, very, very short speech. He said, "This is our fucking city and nobody's going to dictate our freedoms. Boston strong," mic drop, and walked off. And the whole stadium obviously just galvanized around these words, right? And Boston strong became a thing for the months preceding. Everywhere in the city, it was Boston strong written everywhere. The colors of the marathon, the blue and the gold, was everywhere. Like the city galvanized around. And it wasn't even about the two people that planted the bomb. It was all about this has been an attack on our way of life, and that we need to support each other. And I'm just sort of wondering in this moment, where's our David Ortiz? Where is our person who's saying that this has been an attack on our fellow Australian citizens and we are not going to accept this? And I look at my social media feed. Now, whenever there's some sort of tragic event that happens overseas, or even like bushfires here at home, your feed is full of people, sharing moments of solidarity and support. And I know bits of it is very performative, but that's fine. I think that sometimes just people need to show that they care, right? And social media has become a platform to do that. Broadly speaking, my social media feed lately, since Sunday, crickets. Absolute crickets. And I'm just wondering, where are the people coming here to, galvanize? We need someone to lead us to say, this is how you should show your. I think some people just don't know what to do. Like, just don't know how to show their support.
Can I counter that a little? I do think, again, when you are responding to a terrorist attack or an outpouring of grief, there are just some logistics things. Like even where you put the flower memorial for people to leave flowers is a challenge, because you don't want to make it challenging for people to get past. You don't want to leave this like biohazard over the long term. Like these are the kind of things that that the process and the procedure of outpourings of grief have to deal with. But symbolism is part of that, and people do want to do something. I think that the call for blood has been extraordinary. I think that the galvanising of the Australian public around having, I think it is the greatest blood, it doubled the greatest blood donation on record in Australian history, because part of the call to action out of this was we need more blood. I think there has been elements of it. I think that people are looking for things to do. I have seen on my social media, even from people that like have vastly different views from me when it comes to Israel and Palestine, have been lighting candles and putting out and posting that on the social media. And I'm pleased they have. Not as many as I would like, but I really welcome that. So I don't think it's been completely absent. I would like to see it a little bit more sort of fulsome and a little bit more of a skin or a frame put around it.
David, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I think the elephant in the room is that a lot of people are paralysed from responding in the way that you described, Stephen, because of the role they have played, and they know they've played, over the last couple of years around the whole debate in the Middle East and Gaza. And I was sitting at home a few nights ago watching the ABC do, continuous coverage of the events, and there was such little information in the public domain at that stage that the ABC was kind of running continuous coverage based around, 3 known facts and 20 seconds worth of story. And I just thought, well, what's going on here? Is this how they try and wash their hands of a distorted coverage for 2 years of the Middle Eastern conflict? And, how do so many members of our cultural and political elite play the leadership role that you described, Stephen, that you look for, Stephen, when they know themselves that their own words have been so destructive in recent days and recent times? You can't scream on our streets, globalise the Intifada and march under a Hamas flag, and then 6 months later perhaps be the healing national voice that you need to be at a moment like this. So I think that criticism I make is not true of everyone. Of course it isn't. But I think there's a large swathes of our political and cultural elite that are paralysed from playing the leadership role you're describing.
I don't disagree with that. I think what I would hope, though, is even if there is some sheepishness, let's call it, or nervousness about being in this space, it is the time to move into it. Like, it is the time to, and some people will say, well, you weren't saying this 2 years ago, or whatever it is. It is more important that our leaders shake off that hypocrisy or whatever it is and move in and help and support the Jewish community now than try and kind of move off the issue because it's not their strength or try and downplay it.
Yeah, I agree. But it's not easy, is it? I mean, some of them have been booed.
Yeah.
Tony Burke got booed when he was laying a wreath because there's anger here as well. Mm. And this has, crystallised a long-standing sentiment in the Australian Jewish community that they have not been supported and that they've been confronted with a tsunami of misinformation and lies swirling around the community around them, and that behaviours on our streets have been tolerated for month after month after month. And now here we are, and that means that some of the characters that need to play a leadership role have also got to confront anger. And when you're a political leader, a national leader, a cultural leader, and you're trying to do something like lay a wreath, confronting angry crowds is deeply confronting.
It's also part of the job. And I would add to that, like, when Premier Allen went to the shul when was it, Monday night?
Yeah.
It's not as though she walked in there thinking, oh, this is going to be a wondrous response.
No, it was great. It was courage. And she made her cabinet go with her.
Yep.
And she said, suck it up, everybody, you're coming. And it was excellent.
And it's not going to be a friendly crowd. And it wasn't. But I think more credit that she went and didn't try and sort of say, all right, well, we had one rabbi come into cabinet, so, like, we've kind of done the thing. Like, you have to meet people where they are. So, yeah, I agree with you, David, and I think some leaders are doing that.
I do wonder if those, certainly in a government space, and I'm not particularly singling out anyone in particular, maybe are a little bit in shock, and I mean that from a humanistic standpoint, because they've probably heard members, to your point before, David, they've heard members of the Jewish community tell them that the actions that are happening on our streets right now and
graffiti, firebombing,
is eventually it's going to lead to fatal, violence that will end in a fatality.
Eventually someone will globalise the Intifada.
Yeah, but they're not thinking the government is taking it seriously enough, and maybe there's a bit of self-reflection right now from people in leadership positions going, I'm stunned that this has happened. And I think that's a natural human reaction, right?
It is. And basically the atrocity has happened to a community connected to a cause, connected to a wider argument across our society and across the globe. And, for large swathes of Labor and the left, they are felt to be on the wrong side of that argument, or a different side of that argument. So that just makes the awkwardness of providing succour and support even greater, doesn't it? I mean, if you've just been down at the airport welcoming unvetted Gaza refugees into Australia to screams and howls of delight, this is a tough week for you.
That is a good segue into then talking broadly about anti-Semitism. And I want to preface this with two comments that I've read in the past couple of days. The first one is from an article in the Atlantic by David Frum, and I quote, he says, there has remained until now a terrible reluctance by Western governments to accept the appearance on their soil of deadly threats to their Jewish citizens. And the second thing I want to reflect on is Josh Burns, Labor MP for Macnamara, who also happens to be Jewish. And I just want to note Josh is doing a lot of heavy lifting right now on behalf of the Jewish community inside the Labor caucus. Was on the 7:30 report last night, and he was talking about we shouldn't be asking how it happened and therefore this response about gun reform. The question should be why it happened, and that means we have to have a conversation about anti-Semitism in our country. And before we do that, for those of you that aren't, I know certainly David, myself and Jessie have had in our public life have worked in and around amongst the Jewish community here in Melbourne. But for those of you listening who probably don't maybe understand the experience of Jews in Australia to this point, and I'm not Jewish, so I'm certainly not speaking on behalf of them, but as someone who has worked in this space, I can sort of give you some sense of what life would be like. Since my memory anyway, since September 11, Jewish schools and Jewish places of worship have always had security guards out the front of them, plus CCTV cameras, and have put up big fences and perimeters, steel perimeters. If you have ever attended a Jewish or an Israeli film festival, just check out how much security there is to get in there and watch a movie. I remember I dated someone at one period of time who was the manager of the Classic Cinema in Elstonwick, and she always said there's only one night we put security on, and it's Saturday night when Shabbat ends, because it's situated closely to a large Jewish community, and that's where they go see a film. Since October 7, Josh Burns' office has been firebombed twice. The Adass Israel Synagogue got burnt to the ground. The Shabbat Synagogue in St Kilda was also vandalised with pro-Palestinian anti-Semitic graffiti. There was an attempted firebombing of the East Melbourne Synagogue. There was swastika graffiti on Jewish community centres, including the Holocaust Museum here in Melbourne. Jewish parents have been instructing their kids not to answer the door at their home. Free Palestine protests have targeted Jewish restaurants and the National Gallery of Victoria because Jewish families support those particular arts communities. We've been
a Jewish shop here in High Street, Northcote, was targeted until it closed.
Yeah. So this is the experience that this community is feeling in this moment. And I just want to, Jessie, you just mentioned before that you went to the shul on Monday night in Caulfield for the vigil. What was the feeling like inside that shul?
I'd like to say one thing before we talk about that, and that is Stephen and I actually had a conversation. David, you weren't part of it, sorry, about whether it would be useful to have a Jewish Australian on the podcast today to help us talk about this. And part of the reason we thought it was better that we didn't is, frankly, the Jewish communities had to spend a lot of time trying to defend themselves right now and explain anti-Semitism. And it's probably the role of a bunch of us progressives who care deeply about minimising hate in our society, ensuring that bigotry is not allowed to stand, actually take the fight up for our Jewish friends. Because, as you point out, Stephen, Josh is doing a lot of heavy lifting, and it shouldn't only be his job, or Mark Dreyfus's, or Mike Freedman in New South Wales, because they are Jewish Labor members, shouldn't be only their job to have this discussion. So I wanted to say that. You said something a bit earlier, Stephen, about the question about performative, progressives being a bit performative about our solidarity. And I went to the shul on Monday. You and I, after the Christchurch attack in 2019, went to our local mosque to attend a prayer there. We also attended the shul after the October 7 attack. It is part of being society and trying to keep it together. Similarly, when coronavirus first happened, There was that whole people were avoiding Chinese restaurants, and we similarly went out to a Chinese restaurant. We've really engaged in arguably every performative approach to this, and I must admit I've always been a bit, am I just virtue signaling here? And I don't think it is until I stepped into that shul on Monday that I properly understood what it means to communities when someone from outside that community, when they feel like they're under attack, feels support from outside. I think it speaks to how under siege and how alone the community feels, that it is just palpable when you talk to your Jewish friends about your support for them and how pleased they are to hear it. And there's a viral video of a Jewish man I think he's in New York, when a Muslim man comes up and wishes him blessings for what happened in Sydney. And I think part of the reason that has gone so viral is how pleased the Jewish community were to see that. So I also just wanted to say that the shul on Monday was very different to the shul that we visited after October 7, where there was it was a vigil. It was sad. It was shocked. It was kind of, those of you that have gone to a vigil before, very similar to that kind of thing. The feeling out of the shul on Monday night was that of anger, one of, like, I don't want to say I've told you so, but just frustration about how they feel that they have been ringing the bell on this and they don't feel they have got the traction that they need or deserve, of an ongoing frustration with having to explain why they care about Israel, an ongoing frustration of being accused of being a genocidal maniac if someone sees their Star of David. And Stephen, I think you've talked about this before, but the Jewish community in Victoria is one of the most heavily concentrated of Holocaust survivors outside of Israel. That's right?
Correct.
And as the left, we talk so openly and freely about generational trauma and how it has impacted the Aboriginal community and how it impacts people who have been victims of domestic violence and that family violence, and how there's a pattern of that. And I do find it challenging that I don't feel the left have been good at understanding the generational trauma that has come with the Holocaust, and the fact that most Jewish families have a plan B, and that while the vibe in the shul on Monday night is we are not going anywhere, and, we are Australians, we have a right and deserve to be here and to pray and to practice in peace, they also have been through an experience where running was the best option. So I find this a really challenging subject that I don't understand why the left can't see a lot of the things that we talk about and preach about and are concerned about also apply to the Jewish community.
David, can I call on your academic, scholarly, historical perspective for one moment? When I travel to other capital cities other than my home city of Melbourne, and talking to politics folk from within the Labor movement, and if you're having a couple of beers and maybe the topic of Israel may come up, I'm always asked, Stephen, what is it with you Victorian Labor types and your support for the Jewish state? And I'm always befuddled by that. But I think it's worthwhile, before we discuss where we are today in terms of the relationship between the Labor movement or the broad left and our Jewish brothers and sisters, just to give some context for people both in Victoria but also outside of Victoria about the strong bonds that did exist between the Labor movement and the Jewish movement in Victoria and why that was unique.
Well, yes, very happy to do that. I guess a thumbnail sketch is that in the when the State of Israel was formed, and the United Nations moved with its recommendation to create the State of Israel in 1948, it was federal Labor figures playing a key leadership role at the United Nations at that time who supported and moved and cajoled the international community, along with many others, in that direction. So I guess the Australian Labor Party and our leadership at that time felt like they were stakeholders in that important historical moment. And then, of course, in the aftermath of World War II, with waves of refugees coming into Australia, that included a lot of Jewish refugees who made their homes in Australia. And while many of them went on to do spectacularly well in a material sense, they remained very, very sympathetic to the Labor Party as a matter of, I guess, class and history and their own experience. And for the Labor Party's side, and it's sort of hard to imagine today, but at that moment in time, Israel was seen to be an exciting and in many ways a left-wing experiment. It was the time of the kibbutz. It was the time when, left-wing idealists from around the world would spend time on kibbutz working in, cooperatives and collectives. It was a time when organisations like the Histadrut, the Israeli trade union movement, were enormously powerful. The first leaders of Israel were, of course, from the Israeli Labor Party. And so it was our fraternal party, it was our fraternal unions. And of course, Israel built itself in the middle of such a difficult area. It built itself into a welfare state and a democracy and a trade union movement and blah blah blah. And so all of those things meant that for the Labor Party there were real ties of affinity between what we were trying to do in Australia and what we saw was being accomplished in Israel, and it meant that key figures in the union movement here in Australia, I'm talking about people like, Bob Hawke, but many others, Crean, Bill Kelty, it's a big list, had long-standing relationships, personal close relationships with Jewish leaders here in Australia, and relied on those people for support and counsel, and so that. That's why the Victorian Jewish community, indeed the Australian Jewish community, have always been big supporters of causes that kind of defy the modern branding of them. They're big supporters of causes that support refugees. They're big supporters of causes that support Indigenous Australians. People like Noel Pearson, of course, got their articles and their legal start working at Arnold Bloch Liebler under the mentorship of Mark Liebler. So these connections kind of defy the simple binary world of black and white for too many modern political souls. But those relationships were rich, they were historical, they were built on mutual affinities, and that's why I guess as we've seen the state of Israel evolve as an issue in modern times into one which is left-right, that's been distressing because, it wasn't that long ago that both sides of politics here in Australia had deep relationships with the Jewish community and affinities with Israel, and to watch those erode to the point where they are at today is very sad and one of the features of our current predicament.
Jessie, you and I were in the United States a couple of weeks ago, and we met with, you met with a couple of folks who are of the Jewish diaspora.
The chosen people.
Yeah, absolutely. The sons and daughters of Abraham, but also come from a Democratic Party voting bloc. And, if you think about the two major bedrocks of the Democratic voting bloc in the United States, it's the African-American community and it's the Jewish community.
Yeah.
Just to give the listeners some reflections on your conversations with some of those folk and where they are today, because it's not dissimilar to what's going on here in Australia as well.
Yeah, I think that would be the point that I would make, that this experience the left is having the way that the left is responding to the conflict in Gaza right now in terms of its relationship with the Jewish community is not only happening in Australia. I think I was struck particularly with the similarities in the discussions I was having about the feeling of abandonment that, frankly, a bunch of the Jewish people I've been speaking to kind of of the view, like, I understand that you're very concerned about what's happening in Palestine. I understand that you see the things that are happening on television. What I do not understand is why that is stoking your hatred of me as a Jewish person. And I think that experience is unfortunately globalized in the Western democracies, that the left are struggling, and we've sort of talked about this a bit during the show. The left are struggling about how, not unlike, when Corbyn was running the Labor Party in the UK, how are we able to support the Jewish community and frankly have a conversation about Israel and Palestine and their views on what the Israeli state is doing and how it's conducting itself. But
I mean,
and I think you and I are probably going to disagree with it on this, David.
No, the core issue here is it's okay, apparently, to hold every Jew in the world accountable for the actions of the state of Israel. That's okay. But were you to hold every Muslim accountable for the actions of ISIS, you would be accused of Islamophobia.
As you should be.
Quite right.
As you should be.
Sure. So, and this double standard lives before us and goes far too often unchallenged. And so, I'm not against Jews. I'm just against Zionists. How many times have we had to tolerate that phraseology? And of course, the people who utter that usually have a very woolly idea of what Zionism actually is. It's the support for the Jewish people to have sovereignty in their own homeland. Yes, most Jews do support that, but suddenly this word Zionism, misunderstood, becomes an enabler, where I'm not against Jews, I'm just against Zionists. I'm not against Jews, I'm just against Jews, and I'm going to hold them to account here in my suburb, in my street, in my community for what's going on in Israel. It's a disgrace, and it's allowed, and it's normalised.
And perhaps, David, I don't disagree with the things that you were about to say.
Can I want to pull in a quote from George Newhouse, who was the former mayor of Waverley up in Sydney. He wrote an article in The Guardian this week, and it's been shared a lot. That's one thing that I've noticed on my feed is clips from that article have been shared. And there's a couple of quotes I want to do, but I'll just do one here first. Well, to your point here, David, he said, George goes on and says, in recent years, Jewish people in Australia have felt threatened, dismissed, alienated, and at times openly vilified. There is a temptation to explain away or qualify this by references to political differences or debates about events in the Middle East. But that misses the point. Every Jew is not responsible for every decision made by the Israeli government. The right to live free of fear in Australia should not depend on a person's politics, their views on the Middle East, or their religion. And I just think that really does summarise exactly the feeling that's going on right now amongst the Jewish community, and certainly those in the left. Talking to friends of mine who are members of the Labor Party and are probably more left-wing than me on a whole bunch of other issues, and they're saying, "I feel like I have no place in this space right now."
Yeah, because those Jewish people that have made comments about their views about Netanyahu and the government are unfortunately having their comments sort of grabbed and projected back into the left as, even Jewish people hate Jewish people. Like it actually makes it a really it becomes this really challenging space where, like, America, like, there are a bunch of America, like, we don't like Donald Trump. That's not, we think he's terrible. No one is holding all of the Americans they meet in Australia responsible for the actions of Donald Trump. And I do not understand why. Well, I do understand it's anti-Semitism, but we need to accept that holding every Jewish Australian responsible for that is anti-Semitism. Sorry, Steve.
I've also noticed that on social media, some commentary from posts, like influencers or people with a profile. Example, Toilet Paper Australia, which is a left-wing Instagram account. It's got around about 95,000 followers, and broadly speaking, they're a good comrade on a whole bunch of things in terms of just general domestic politics. Shared a post from someone called Zealot999, where they are blaming the Netanyahu government for the deaths of 15 Jews in Sydney, the actions of the Netanyahu government, and goes on to say that Zionists and Israel are to blame for the deaths of those Jews. And I've seen other social media posts saying similar, like Zionism is a conservative, right-wing extremist ideology, which, to your point before, we have just literally forgotten what Zionism is. Yeah, no, the current Netanyahu government is in a coalition with conservative right-wing extremists. That is a fact, and I will criticize until the cows come home, but I will not be labeled an anti-Semite for doing that. The project of Zionism is not this conservative far-right extremism. It is, and I think folks need to get
It's also not expansionism.
No, I know, exactly. Zionism, to your point, David, Zionism is the belief that Israel is the ancestral land of the Jews and is a modern state where is a safe haven for Jews to live. In a pluralist, liberal democracy, Zionism is a wonderful thing, but it has now become a anti-Semitic slur, and I don't think they even realise that. They think they're cute by not saying the word Jew and saying Zio or Zionist, but it's time we need to reclaim that word back.
It's become a permission framework, hasn't it, where you can use this word Zionism that you don't really comprehend, and that gives you permission to be anti-Semitic without being anti-Semitic. That's what we're at.
So I want to now, if we can, just sort of move on to how we got here. And I also want to quote from the George Newhouse article again. And he says, over the past 2.5 years, some groups have deliberately travelled to events in the city, Bondi and the eastern suburbs to intimidate the local Jewish communities, talking about in New South Wales, but the same can be said about in Melbourne as well, often with little public condemnation. At protest marches, chants calling for the violence against Jews have been heard, reinforcing the message, whether intended or not, that Jewish people are fair game. When racial and religious hatred is left unaddressed, and intimidation is tolerated, it creates an environment that emboldens the worst elements of society and leaves Jewish people feeling diminished. Jessie, your thoughts on how the broad left have cultivated this environment that we exist in right now?
Yeah, and I just want to be very clear. I don't think that this is, by the majority of the people on the left, a deliberate act. I think there are a bunch of them who don't necessarily consider their activities to be anti-Semitic. I think they go to the rallies because they are genuinely concerned about what is happening in Palestine. And I think that needs to be acknowledged, that this isn't, everyone in those rallies, hates Jews. I don't think that. What I do think is that there is a role and responsibility for community organisers when organising a community to set norms about accepted behaviour in that community. And we've talked a lot about political leadership from our elected leaders, but we also need to talk about the community leadership from the left here when it comes to what is accepted at those rallies and what isn't. Stephen, you and I live in the city and we hear a lot of the chants that come out of those rallies, and some of them are just blatant anti-Semitic. There is only one solution to this problem type chants. We all know what that means. I think the responsibility of the leadership of this group has either ignored the anti-Semitism or have deliberately stepped around it. And I think that participants in those rallies need to realise that they are in part responsible for the actions of a group. And Stephen, you talk about community organising and the point of empowerment and setting norms. Like, this is a failure if those kind of chants keep happening time and time again at those rallies.
I'll go to David in a minute because I know that David's got some strong views on this. Look, I'm not in these meetings, right? But from what I can get a sense from talking to people certainly through the trade union movement, is that these the Free Palestine movement here in Australia is quite big and wide and varied. And I think that they are struggling to keep some sort of consistent message going, because I think it's a mix of folks that are just upset about what's going on in the Middle East in terms of, people just, peace activists that just don't want conflict. There are trots who are anti-imperialist, anti-Israel, anti-Semitic types that have always been fighting against the United States and Israel and everything else, and have bought all of the bullshit about colonialism and all that kind of stuff. And then there are...
Sorry, colonialism is a thing, whether...
But to imply that the Jews are not the ancestral
Yes.
Inhabitants of the Levant, right? And to say that they are all white from Eastern Europe, denying the fact that 50% of Israel is made up of Mizrahi Jews who are from that region.
I think it's more like 70%.
Yeah. So there's the trots, right? And then there's obviously a large Muslim diaspora that are going along there. And I'll say this interestingly enough, and I think a lot of them were going along because they felt like their brothers and sisters in Palestine were dying, and so they were going there to support them. And within that, there is an Islamic or an Islamist kind of element that would be bad actors that I don't think that regular run-of-the-mill Muslims would identify with them. Over the last 2 years of watching these rallies, I'm seeing less people who would identify as being Muslim. I'm seeing less, like there was a lot of young women.
It's becoming wider.
In hijabs. It's fundamentally becoming much wider. And I think they've turned up and gone, blow there. Blow there. So I don't want to be a part of it because these trots are arguing about where they would go and what they were chanting and all that kind of stuff. So there's clearly tensions going on with the Free Palestine movement. And I do think that some elements within the Free Palestine movement need to hold their hands up and say, we played a role in in the increase of anti-Semitism in this country. I'm not blaming them for the events of Sunday, but I'm just saying that you did not help this growth of anti-Semitism. David, your thoughts?
Well, I think there are really two strands of anti-Semitism that come together at those rallies, and they're different. And one of those strands is the fact that there's a lot of anti-Semitic sentiment inside our Islamic community. And if you listen to some characters from our Islamic community, they will talk about that themselves. The fact that Jewish slurs and anti-Jewish opinion is something that you might encounter around the kitchen table. This is a problem which we can't ignore. That anti-Semitism is stronger in some parts of our community than in others, and then there is obviously the Islamist tendency, and we can't underestimate that either. And let me play you a clip here of what a crowd of Islamic Australians were doing on the 8th of October, the day after that dreadful massacre in southern Israel.
Smiling, and I'm happy. I'm elated. It's a day of courage. It's a day of happiness. It's a day of pride. It's a day of victory. This is the day we've been waiting for.
So what we need to be honest about here is that that is a problem. And it's often very, very difficult for political leaders, particularly progressive political leaders, to describe problems like that are found in minority communities. But it's real, and we have to confront it, because those sorts of characters are part of this story, the characters we just heard from a moment ago, and they are at the rallies. And that is why we find Hamas flags and Iranian Revolutionary Guards flags and big portraits of Ayatollah Khomeini at these rallies, because those guys are there. And then the second strand is, of course, the left, which is obviously a big label. And I think this discussion is also crucial. And the first element of the left's failing here is the fact that it has bought the idea that every Jew everywhere can be held accountable. And so that's why it's okay for a rally to wander off to a Melbourne synagogue or to attack the electorate office of a Jewish MP. Every Jew can be held accountable. And secondly, then, to have bought this nonsensical critique of Israel, which says that, Israel is, of course, this incredible story of how an Indigenous people regained sovereignty over their ancestral land. But in the sort of woke doctrines taught at our universities for a long time now, they are white colonisers who are installed into the land by superpowers and have been oppressing Indigenous Arabs ever since. And then on top of that falsehood, there is a whole lot of critical labelling that's gone on around the conflict in the Middle East, where and it's become okay to talk about Israel as an apartheid state. It's become okay to imagine that Israel is engaging in a genocide, that Hamas is and its tactics are resistance, that the Hamas organisation is a reasonable place from which one can gain analysis and statistics about the conflict, that Israel has engineered a famine inside Gaza. All of these falsehoods are promulgated, and they're promulgated until everyone's heard them enough that they no longer shock. They just become part of the political discourse, and they are lies. UNRWA is an organisation that has been completely discredited by its logistical connections with Islamic terrorism, and yet it remains a cause leftists will argue. 2 million Arabs live in Israel with greater rights than their compatriots enjoy in any other part of the Middle East, and yet Israel gets accused of apartheid. I could go on. So we can hold every Jew accountable for the work of the State of Israel, and we can promulgate these lies, these blood libels against the State of Israel, which make it the cause desperately clear. And this is why people, both ill-intentioned and people of good faith, are marching in our streets and finding themselves underneath these foreign flags and finding themselves chanting things like death, death, death to the IDF and let's globalise the Intifada. Because some of them know what they're saying, some of them don't know what they're saying, but the words are the same and words are bullets. And that has created the environment which helped a father and a son decide to commit bloody murder, and that's why so many people in our media and in our political elite now feel desperately politically compromised because they've watched this week after week, month after month. How does the leader of the Greens say anything useful at this moment for Australia? Well, of course they can't, can they? Because they've been knee-deep in this squalid story from the 8th of October. And so here we are, and we've all got to come to terms. This is a reckoning. We have to come to terms with these dreadful truths, that we have anti-Semitic populations among us, and we have to tackle that. And we have lies and misinformation that's been allowed to wander our streets and our political discourse unchallenged for too long.
I'm a solutions guy at the heart of who I am, and I'm just wondering about how we move through this. Jessie, I'm interested in your thoughts on this. I know the Siegel report was handed down in July, and some of the recommendations have been passed, but not all of them, and the government kind of sat on them for a bit, but now looks like after the events of Sunday that they're trying to move on that. I just want to I don't think, and even Siegel said herself, there is no silver bullet to this. There is probably not a great choice of words given what happened on the weekend, but there's no way of actually addressing this with one report. This is going to take time, but I just want to get your thoughts, Jessie, about how we on the left can start to be better allies for our Jewish brothers and sisters.
Yeah, I think that there are so many things we can do. I think that there are people who are listening to this podcast that have just heard everything that David has said and will have declared it Zionist propaganda and switched off. And if you are one of those people, I think my ask of you is to, whenever you think about how you're speaking about the Jewish people, if you were going to put in African or if you were going to put in Muslim, would you feel comfortable saying the same thing is a reasonable test? Even if you were going to reject all the things that David just said, do we think that if a crowd of people went and protested out of the front of the NGV because they had a significant number of donations from the Sudanese community, that we would call that anything but racist. Like, I think that even if you just take it back to the very basics of the things that we argue for as the left, when the opposition talked about African gangs, we were so clear about the impact that could have on the African community and what that means for them. And I appreciate you've asked me about the federal government, but I think given we've spent a lot of time talking about the left, I think just take it back to basics. If you hear someone saying something and you think, if you used a different ethnicity in there, would I be comfortable with it? Then someone is saying something anti-Semitic, and you need to correct them on that. And you need to think about how your language is being interpreted. Because I don't think everyone at that rally thought Globalise the Intifada would mean 14, 15 people getting shot, 16 people getting shot at a religious ceremony in Bondi.
But it meant exactly that, didn't it? That's what the Intifada was.
That is globalising the Intifada. It's a violent uprising.
And critical thinking. The left has to engage in ruthless critical thinking. Like, if South Africa has accused Israel of genocide, but South Africa will not grant visas to Palestinian refugees, how do you square that circle? Pronouncements from the UN are given extraordinary importance. The UN Human Rights Council consists of Cuba, Qatar, China, Sudan, Algeria and Vietnam, all of whom are ranked not free by Freedom House. How do these pronouncements matter in one part of our analysis and never matter in others? Where's the critical thinking of the left where we can analyse these outrageous charges, things like genocide? I mean, we are now watching Hamas operatives move through the streets of Gaza, shooting on camera their own people for disagreeing with them, and there's not an outcry. We've just watched 60,000 Muslims butchered over 2 days in Western Sudan, and there's not an outcry. What is it about Gaza that means the death of Muslims drive people to frenzy, and yet mass executions in Western Sudan count for nothing? Let's use our critical thinking and ask ourselves these tough questions.
We're almost at our hour, and I just want to get sort of final reflections. And I've been thinking a lot myself about how do we deal with this. And there was someone we were talking to yesterday who's just, I think, what I'd call is a regular Australian, and had sort of said, it's just extremism. We've just got to stamp out extremism.
We've got to stop tolerating the intolerant.
Yeah. Like cookers who attacked police during COVID, like straight to jail. Neo-Nazis on the steps of Parliament, straight to jail.
Yeah, both of them should be arrested.
Yeah. Anti-Semites for calling on the destruction of a sovereign nation and the people who live within it, straight to jail. Like just any kind of extremism. That just, if there's one norm that I think that kind of defines Australians, is that
you are celebrating death on our streets. If you are encouraging terrorism on our streets, you should be in trouble.
Yeah. There's a social contract that we've got here. You either flew here or you grew here, and the deal is that we want you to bring, your customs, your culture, your great food, your resources, your intellect, and in exchange, we want you to make a contribution to this great society. Don't be a dickhead. Know that, from Christmas all the way through till the kids go back to school, no one's doing any work. And we're going to look after each other. That's kind of the Australian contract. And we don't tolerate extremism, unlike other countries, including liberal democracies like what's going on in the UK or what's going on in the United States. That's not what we do. And I just think we need to start to put our foot down. And I think general Aussies need to turn to each other when we hear kind of extremist language, just call that shit out and go, mate, pull your head in.
And we need a state response. We need the state to respond as well.
Yeah. Can I just add my final reflection, which is I've seen and had discussions with people on the left right now that they are worried that this violent anti-Semitic attack is going to be used as an excuse to allow Zionism. And I think And sort of this idea that, the Liberals are politicising the response by saying that Jewish people aren't safe here, that John Howard has been overly political, that this is a time for us all to come together and not, act overly political about it. And I would say to those of you who are thinking along those lines, when there is a bushfire and the people on the left say climate change has played a role in this, and the people on the right say this is not the time to talk about climate change, and we think, well, when else would you talk about climate change and reconsider your actions that have led to this than after a bushfire, after the direct impact of it? And for those in America who say a mass shooting is not the time to talk about gun control, in the same breath, the left saying this is not the time to, examine anti-Semitism and it shouldn't be used as an excuse to do that. It should. This is the time to have that discussion. And if you are resisting that, please consider why you are resisting it. And as David says, use some of your critical analysis about what that means and what kind of conversations you're in, and just take a step back.
David, final thoughts?
For too long, too many people inside the left have been going along to get along, and we need to have this argument internally anew.
Indeed. This has been a heavy podcast. I know that normally when we do the Feeney Files, we have categories and all that kind of stuff to try and bring a bit of lightness to the work. We're not doing that today, but in the new year, we'll obviously be back with the Feeney Files with Jessie McCrone to probably do a recap of 2025. That's what this episode was meant to originally be, but obviously the events of Sunday just meant that we just weren't in a place to do that. Can I just encourage everyone who's listened to the show, one, we appreciate your feedback. Two, donate blood. Three, if you know someone in the Jewish community, just give them a call and just have a chat to them, and ask questions and listen. And learn from their experiences. We'll be a lot better if we look after each other going forward. So this episode was more about trying to get reflection and ask some hard questions that people will be uncomfortable with. But I think being in an uncomfortable space actually is when we have growth, and that's why we did today's episode. Thanks very much for listening. Jessie, David, thank you very much for your contribution today. I hope you both have a very good Christmas break, whatever you may be doing. And happy Hanukkah to our Jewish brothers and sisters, and we'll be back next week with another episode.
See you later, and thank you very much.
Thank you.